Welcome to the California Restaurant Association Confidential Bulletin Podcast. Today, we're going to have a conversation with renowned economist Dr. Chris Thornberg. We're going to talk about, among other things, the FAST Act and the impacts that it's having on youth unemployment.
And now for a word from our sponsor.
I've noticed the flowers are blooming and the bees are buzzing. That's great, but it also means allergy season is upon us. Not feeling like driving to the pharmacy to pick up those meds? Don't bother. Get your meds delivered. DoorDash, your door to more. Download the DoorDash app now to get almost anything delivered. Must be 21 and older to order alcohol. Drink responsibly. Alcohol available only in select markets.
Chris, Dr. Thornberg, welcome to the podcast. Appreciate you making the time joining us today.
Thrilled to be here, Jot.
So, Chris, before we get into, we're going to talk about a white paper that I'm looking at right now. But before we get into this white paper about youth unemployment in California, why don't you tell us a little bit about Beacon Economics?
Sure. So Beacon Economics is a company I started about 20 years ago. You know, I left UCLA, the UCLA forecast, and knew that what I wanted to do in the private sector was very much what we did there at the UCLA forecast back in the day, which was tie together what I would call, academic methodology. That is to say, using the type of systems that academics use to understand the world around us and candidly sticking to the various codes of behavior, if you will, that academics are supposed to stick to, and apply that to real-world conversations. So since that point in time, my company's grown to about 20 people, and we do studies from labor markets to impact analyses to policy studies across the board. But it's very much what I would call an organization that is committed to letting the data drive the narrative, rather than what we see so often in the world, which is, the narrative driving the use of the data. For us, we want to do it the right way around, start with the data, use good theory, try to understand what's going on. We do it from we try to start with a very unbiased position in order to come up with, I think, are the most honest answers to understand the world around us on a day-to-day basis.
So you've done some work for us. In fact, I'm trying to remember, you probably remember the year, was maybe 2015 you did, it was the start of the year-over-year minimum wage increases that were happening, and I think there was a local minimum wage in the Sacramento area, and we hired you to do an analysis on the impacts of minimum wage, and I remember you telling me, well, you may not like the outcome. I'm going to do an analysis, and you're going to get the report is going to be the report, right? You don't have a say in its conclusion. And it turns out that the conclusion to your report basically confirmed what we saw in the restaurant industry is it was going to have a negative impact. Was that 2015?
Actually, we released that paper very early 2019. I believe we started the project in late 2017. It took us a little while to pull together, as the case may be. But what we did was, on that particular report, is we looked at a cross-section of states and looked at different minimum wage policies in these different states and tried to ask the fundamental question, can one see the impact of the higher than normal minimum wage here in California on their performance of the state's restaurant industry? Now, to be clear, obviously studying the minimum wage is nothing new in economics. Minimum wage has been around for decades and decades. It really started in the 1930s. And in many ways, it has become a sort of go-to tool for those who have a political opinion that puts them on the left side of the spectrum as a way of reducing inequality. That's the story, at least, right? And what's interesting, of course, is go back to the idea that, at least within my company, we start with the data and allow that data to tell us what's going on. In our modern world, of course, it's not done like that very often, particularly in the rough and tumble world of political analysis. People who are, in many ways, have a narrative that they want to promote, and they turn around and, if you will, build stories to support that particular result. And, of course, the minimum wage is really infamous for this. Minimum wages they're basically wage floors. And the study of wage floors suggests that when you raise a price, whether it's a price for a good or a price for a service such as labor, if you raise that above the market clearing level, you're going to have a situation where you end up with more supply and less demand, and you come up with, of course, basically excess inventory. Or in the case of labor, we call that rising unemployment rates. Now, the idea that wage floors create this kind of disequilibrium is just common sense in economics. But for those who've wanted to promote, if you will, the minimum wage as a way of reducing income inequality in the United States, they have gone out of their way to try and create doubt about that particular result. And it goes all the way back to a very famous paper in economics called Card&Kruger, which looked at the impact of minimum wages on employment. I think it was in New Jersey. And they did some special kind of analysis looking at the border, I believe Pennsylvania and New Jersey, or perhaps New York and New Jersey, to see if the higher minimum wage in New Jersey was creating some distortions in employment. And they famously came up with a result that said that they couldn't see any result. They came up with the idea that you could raise the minimum wage and not have, if you will, some cost, that would be a free policy, so to speak. Well, away to the races we go. Over the next 2 decades, there's been a whole sort of cottage industry of folks out there, many of them working for institutions such as the Berkeley Labor Center, who have gone out of the way to build a larger and larger portfolio of research which claim that minimum wages don't have an impact on employment. And that, of course, has been a big part of the underpinning of getting California to indulge in higher and higher and higher minimum wages. This is why, of course, right now we're at $16 an hour in the state overall. Fast food restaurants that are in franchises now have to face a $20 an hour minimum wage. How could we have gotten so extreme? How could we have pushed these numbers up so high? Well, again, twofold. One, building a narrative that minimum wages are a costless way of dealing with income inequality. But the second two parts of that, of course, are both to convince people that we have a massive problem of income inequality, and that in turn goes to the conversation about whether we're the living wage analyses that we see us around us. So because they've diminished the potential impact of the minimum wage, because they've turned around and told us that this is something that's essential to have done, California is engaged in this extreme experiment of pushing minimum wages up dramatically, and we are really starting to see the results. Now, there are two ways of thinking about the results. When I did that first study for you back in 2018, 2019, that was a study that really had to dig a little deep into the data to find the results of the impact of the higher minimum wage. If we go back, remember, say, prior to the pandemic, minimum wages in California were $13, $14 an hour. And at that level, they were still low enough that you didn't see the minimum wage clearly in the data. Look, anybody will tell you that between 2010 and 2019, employment in restaurants in California went up. And that, by the way, is a kind of simplistic way of saying, see, minimum wages don't matter. But the number of jobs in restaurants in any economy is a function of supply and demand, right? It's not just one side or the other. So what we saw over that period of time was, yes, rising minimum wages, which reduced the demand for labor, but at the same time, the California economy was expanding and people were making more money, and that increases the demand for restaurant services. What this means is that you're right, the minimum wage wasn't high enough to reduce the absolute number of jobs within the industry, but what we captured in our analysis is something a little bit more subtle, but just as real. What we saw in our analysis was, of course, the concept that when you raise the minimum wage, you got fewer jobs than you would have otherwise. That is to say, our analysis suggested by 2019, had California not been raising their minimum wage so aggressively, the industry would have had 40 to 50,000 more jobs than it would have otherwise. So there were lost jobs. There were lost employment opportunities there. You just couldn't see it at the very top level. You had to be if you will, a little bit more subtle about teasing those impacts out. So they were there. There's no doubt about it. But again, a little hard to find, which is why those who support minimum wage have been able to, if you will, create such a smokescreen to claim that these kind of policies really don't matter, that they're just a costless way of dealing with a really serious problem.
Well, and we're seeing this play out in real time now with the FAST Act. Talk about an extreme example, right?
Well, absolutely. And again, this goes back to the idea that when you think about the other side of the conversation, the other side of the debate, well, let me back up just for a second, because one of the things over the last decade in my career at Beacon Economics that I've started to realize is that one of the foundational assumptions of economics that I learned when I was in grad school is a little bit wrong. And that foundational assumption is the idea of what we call the rational agent, that people really do see the world in a reasonable, rational way and take that information and try to make the best economic decisions they can. And in economics, what we do is we run around pretending that we can determine how people make the best decision, given that they have all this information. Now, that does lead to some oddities within the field. For example, not to get too deep into it, but in that world, if you imagine a rational agent, it's very hard to figure out why we have recessions, which, if you hadn't noticed, happen all the time. So it's kind of a big problem for economics. And I've watched macroeconomists do cartwheels trying to explain why we have recessions in this rational agent model. If you take a step back and relax the rational agent model, if we understand that people see the world in extremely biased ways, if they have all sorts of cognitive biases for how they interpret the information, how they see the world, when you see it in that way, you realize that our narratives, our social stories can become unglued from basic economic realities. And in this world, well, different kind of things take place than what you would assume in a standard Chicago world of the rational agent. It makes it very easy to understand why we have recessions. It makes it very easy to see why we continuously pursue policies that really don't make a lot of sense in any kind of objective way, such as, for example, a higher minimum wage. So the idea in this particular world, of course, is if you want to have an influence on policy, you have to change the narrative. How I see it is very simple. If you want good policies, you have to have the right narrative. For other folks, it's a little different. For them, they see a policy as a fundamental moral imperative. You will hear this very often in, say, for example, these various labor centers and the work they put out. If you don't have to go too deep into literature to figure out that what they are saying is the consequences are irrelevant because the moral imperative is a higher order. And in that world, what they do is they're constantly trying to move the narrative to support the policies they want seen put in place. So I find myself in this world of combating narratives, if you will, where we try to build the one that's based on the data, where others are trying to build it based on their overall, shall we say, policy objectives. And that's, again, classic case of what we see here. We're constantly seeing forces on the left telling us that this is a costless policy to achieve real goals. And what the data tells us is this is not a costless policy. This policy has very real costs. And by the way, they don't really get to the overall goals in a very good manner. In other words, we don't see minimum wages reducing inequality. We don't see minimum wages reducing poverty levels. We just see it kind of moving the chips around the table and not having what I would call a true overarching impact on the overall distributional aspects of a local economy. Now, with this being said, well, this goes back to some of the work that I've been doing with you, Jot, at the California Restaurant Association over the years. You know, we did that first study talking about how there were real costs of the rising minimum wage, although, again, they were subtle. You couldn't see them, but they were there if you use the right sort of controls. I'm not the only person to say this. There's a number of economists who've gone through a very similar sort of analysis. In fact, a very good one. There's a Professor Newmark down at UC Irvine who's done some very similar analysis over the years and come up with very similar results to what we've seen. But again, over and over, you could see this impact. Another study we did, actually not for the California Restaurant Association, but actually the International, I think, Franchise Association in 2021, rather. Of course, we had the big move to the FAST Act. Mm-hmm. Now, the FAST Act was above and beyond a normal minimum wage. A typical minimum wage is where, well, basically we create a base minimum wage and every industry has to meet that particular wage floor. Now, I'll tell you that for most industries, wage floors don't mean all that much. Your typical law firm doesn't hire many people near the minimum wage, and the few they do is such a small part of their overall wage bill that it doesn't have an enormous impact on them. But for some industries, such as restaurants or nonprofits, retail, in these industries, minimum wages have a big impact because they're very labor intensive, and a lot of the folks that they hire tend to be lower skilled, lower paid. So these industries see it significantly. Now, for whatever reason, there was a shift in, shall we say, policy strategies among those pushing for higher minimum wages. It seems as if what they did was move away from this idea of having global higher minimum wages to starting to focus on individual industries. And the first industry they really focused on was the fast food industry. Again, not surprising why. Obviously, it's an industry that hires a lot of lower skilled, lower paid people. It's very much in the public eye. And you could make some interesting stories about it to help support a certain narrative, which is what they went about doing. Basically, they told the story that people in fast food were in dead-end jobs and they were suffering, they were being exploited, and that the industry it was morally impingent upon them to pay these folks more. And so they carved out just fast food franchise restaurants for a very specific set of rules and regulations. Now, the initial, of course, law, the original FAST Act, was really draconian. That would have taken the entire industry and put it under the control of an unelected 10-person appointed board where at least 4 of the people came out of labor and 2 came from the governor, which is to say that 60% of the votes were going to be pro-labor, right. And basically give these folks unilateral control over the industry. In the end, the board wasn't actually formed. They compromised to a $20 an hour minimum wage, and lo and behold, off to the races we went. We started seeing, of course, a big change in cost of labor in that industry. Now, back then in 2021, we did a report that suggested that, and I know this sounds shocking, Jot, please work with me, that if you dramatically increase the pay for people in fast food restaurants, that you were going to see a consequence at the counter in terms of higher prices. Now, the fact that higher input costs lead to higher output costs, this is, again, a pretty standard outcome in economics. We all know that, of course, as soon as the price of oil goes up in the international markets, a barrel of oil goes over $100, $110 a barrel, pretty soon you're going to be paying higher prices at that pump. We know how this works. But amazingly, the folks that were for the FAST Act went out of their way to yet again build a bunch of literature suggesting, well, guess what? It's costless even on that front. Not only does it cause workers to make more money costlessly, but people on the other side of the counter don't have to pay for it. In this magical world, according to their models, you raise the minimum wage and the money comes straight out of the CEO's wallet, straight to the workers. It's a wonderful world, right? Straight out of a Frank Capra movie.
And so since April 1st, right, we've been reading in the top fold of virtually every newspaper in California and in fact nationally about the consequences. And you've done a paper, and I'm looking at it now, and it's pretty thick, and it's got more footnotes than a David Foster Wallace novel.
Well, this is the newest one. This isn't the one we wrote on prices, which got me in so much trouble in the state. As you know, it's interesting. Go through my series of papers I've written over the last few years on this particular topic. We had the one in 2019, which said that the higher minimum wage cost jobs. That one was ignored. The price one we did in 2021 was not ignored. That one got the attention
Well, let's talk about that, like the attention that it got and the consequences, because I think this is an important sub-theme here. Tell us about how it was noticed and what happened, right? You were running a economics center out of UC Riverside at the time, correct?
Yeah, forecasting center, that's right. We were doing forecasts and various sorts of regional analyses and some policy analyses based out of a great partnership we have with UC Riverside for, 6 or 7 years by that point in time, a number of very successful conferences out in the Inland Empire. We had done a number of important policy bits. I think, candidly, we were doing some of the best work on the Inland Empire out of that particular center.
It was nationally recognized. You would read, your work was in, national newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. I mean, you were often cited as an authority. And of course, your research was being noticed, but some folks disagreed with it. So what happened?
Well, again, so we put the paper out there that said that if labor costs go up, prices are going to go up. Now, it's interesting. And this goes back to, if you will, the power of narratives in our world around us, right? Why was my paper on the loss of jobs in restaurants largely ignored? Well, the answer is our analysis was technical. That is to say, you couldn't see the losses at the top line. It was a but-for analysis. But for the increase in minimum wage, there would have been more jobs, right? Now, this is a very subtle effect, and candidly, in the court of public opinion, and in this world of screaming headlines, that's not a clickbait finding. That doesn't get people riled up, as the case may be. Ergo, again, from the other side of the fence, from the other side of the debate, ignore it. There's no point in giving them any more attention than they deserve. Otherwise, just let it go, right? But the price one, that got people's attention. And in fact, what we did was we went through and we looked at everything that the initial FAST Act could have put into place. And it suggested that labor costs, once you added in the benefits, the big increase in minimum wage up to $22 an hour, you're talking about predictive scheduling, extra safety procedures, minimum staffing. I mean, it really went on what the list of stuff they wanted was. And the net result was labor costs could have gone up by something as much as about 50%. And our report showed that a 50% increase in labor costs, once it fully works through the system, it doesn't happen immediately, it takes a year or two, that you could see a 50% increase in labor costs would lead to anything between an 18 and 22% increase in prices. Well, that got people's attention. There's one thing people do not like is the price of their Big Mac going up, right? We know this. We see the outcry. People notice it clearly. And that got people's attention.
Yeah, it got people's attention. What people and what was the consequence of that attention?
Well, there was a campaign, right? So again, the last story these guys put out, we can ignore. This story we can't, right? So what do you do? Well, you go after the messenger, and again, this is very standard. If you can't beat the narrative, shut it down. Yeah. Right? Don't, in our world in rough and tumble politics, it is okay to squelch the other side's analysis, as the case may be. Again, remember what we're trying to accomplish here. We want people to think that a higher minimum wage is a costless way of dealing with these enormous social crises. And if you tell people it's not costless, well, maybe they're not going to be so for it. So let's shut these guys down. And lo and behold, you had a number of petitions going up around various sorts of academics within the UC system, particularly some academics at UC Riverside specifically, folks who were saying that my center was corrupted. It was nothing more than a tool of corporate propaganda, pitching untrue things. And they ended up creating such a ruckus that, let's keep something in mind. The UC system has had a tough time with the labor movement over the last couple of years. We can all acknowledge that. Even long after I've been gone, you saw, of course, we had strikes coming right into finals week in the UC system. They had to get a court to shut them down. So the UC system, the various chancellors and deans, this for them is nothing but a headache. And so the school decided that the easiest path was to simply let my center get shuttered, despite all the good work we've done.
And it turns out that the work
integrity. Yeah, exactly.
And it turns out that the work that you did and the predictions you made have come true.
Somewhat. We want to be a little cautious about that, Jot. Look, my initial analysis said that it takes some time for these prices to fully come through. I would argue that what we're seeing at some level is prices are up all the way around because of overall inflation. In other words, prices for fast food are up here as well as everywhere else just because the price of everything is going up. But then California's price increases are larger than the national ones because of these new rules, and you're going to see that continue to play out over the course of the next year or so. One of the things that those on the other side, really either side of these debates, constantly exploit is the idea that the economy doesn't drop immediately to a new equilibrium, right? For example, just here in the last couple of days in the LA Times, there's a columnist by the name of Michael Hiltzik who wrote a very strident, column. You're calling fast food a bunch of liars. The minimum wage has no impact on fast food. Why? Because we haven't seen a loss in jobs. Now, a couple things here. First of all, as already noted, if there's an increase in demand, that can offset things. You are still losing jobs even if the absolute number of jobs fall. So already he's on thin ice. But with that being said, it's also too early. This thing's going to take a little while to shake out. Labor costs are going up. Right now, what's going through is there's a big shakeup in the industry. Prices are coming up. Some folks are starting to back off on eating as much. There's families walking in, looking at the price of a meal for four at McDonald's, which is now $70. It used to be $40. And they're going, hey, we got to back off on this. We can't afford it. And what that means is over time, you're going to start seeing some fast food places close down. You're going to see some bankruptcies. And
we're seeing that now. We're seeing that now. You have, a family-owned franchisees who have, 3-4 locations, and they're shutting down 2 because they can't afford it. We're seeing it. So it's almost like that Michael Hiltzik. Hiltzik? Is that how it's pronounced?
Hiltzik, I think is how you pronounce it. But,
it was just a hit job and just sort of dismissing the real-world impacts that, are confronting these small business owners. There's another impact. So let's get to your paper because I remember you and I, you were here in Sacramento speaking. You do a lot of that. You were speaking to some conference, and you pinged me because you had this aha moment. You were looking at some data, and you said, hey, I just had an aha moment. Do you have a minute? And we were talking about the numbers you were seeing, and you've since turned this into a paper. Tell me about, because I think, the restaurant industry, we pride ourselves in being, one of the few industries that, are a point of entry into the workforce. We offer jobs to those that are, no experience. Many times people that can't find a job because, let's say, they've been incarcerated. The restaurant opportunities that are provided for those people looking for a second chance are innumerable. And especially kind of youth employment. So what are you seeing on that? Well, what is your study?
Let me back up a second, and that's a great pivot. But let me give the broader context here. First of all, the last 2 studies I just I noted are ones that we did primarily on the restaurant industry. Right, we were focusing on just that sector, in part because the restaurant industry is probably more subject to higher minimum wages than most any other industry. The only one that comes to mind would be, say, for example, retail trade would be one that is also fairly subject to this issue. With that being said, last year, 2 years in California, something odd has happened. and that is that the California unemployment rate has started drifting up. Now, to be clear, you look across the United States, and a couple of years ago, the economy was on fire. It was overheated, as a matter of fact, by the ridiculous stimulus thrown at the economy as a result of the pandemic stimulus that was thrown into place by the Federal Reserve and Congress. Since that point in time, the economy is cooling to a more normal equilibrium, and so you feel the economy settling down. For example, the unemployment rate in the U.S. went from 3.3% up to about 4%. 4% is what most economists would argue is a good number for our labor markets. That's an unemployment rate that seems reasonable. But California's came up and didn't stop, and now it's about 5%, which means that California's unemployment rate has come up well over a percentage point and a half over the course of the last 2 years, but it's also now the highest unemployment rate in the entire nation, of any state in the nation, which is not a typical place for California to be. What is going on? Well, we started digging into this a little bit. And remember that the overall narrative about California is that our economy is doing terrible. Now, why it's doing terrible depends on who you're talking to. The right will say we're a socialist catastrophe and businesses and rich people are fleeing the state. The left will tell you we're a capitalist a catastrophe and workers are moving to find a more dignified employment opportunity outside the state. Whatever the case may be is. The reality is our economy's fine. If you look at underlying numbers, it is true we have less labor force growth than the rest of the United States, but that's only because we don't have enough housing. And our output growth, by the way, is greater than the rest of the United States, and incomes are growing faster here. So at a lot of different levels, California's economy still has a shine, not quite as shiny as it once was, but still has that golden shine. And thus, looking at this unemployment rate going up seems a little odd. Now, the second thing to say is, well, wait a minute, isn't tech getting hammered? What about the big strike in motion pictures? We know the movie industry is suffering. Aren't these folks the reason why you have an unemployment rate going up? Well, a couple things here to think about. If you go to the initial claims for unemployment insurance, our initial claims for unemployment insurance haven't risen. So whoever's not getting a job, it's not somebody who was laid off, because you would see that in claims for unemployment insurance. This isn't it. So yeah, tech is cooling off, movies are cooling off, but these people are finding jobs elsewhere. So what's going on? What we did is we dug a little deeper into the current population survey, and as soon as you do that, it all becomes immediately clear. Who represents this growing group of people who would like jobs but can't get them? The answer is 90% of these people are 24 and below. It is young folks that can't get jobs. It's particularly 16 to 19. This group is getting absolutely hammered. The unemployment rate for this group has gone from 10% to 20% and rising rapidly. Young people are not getting jobs. Well, why? Look no farther than the minimum wage. You know, there's two things to remember. Again, the overall vision is that when minimum wage go up, companies want fewer people. Ergo, you have rising unemployment rates. But at the ground level, it's a way more subtle effect than that. Take, for example, your typical fast food restaurant who, 5-6 years ago had to pay their people $13 an hour. Now it's $20 an hour. And it's not just you have to raise everybody by $7 an hour. There's a cascading effect. Your entry-level people are now $20 an hour, which means somebody who's worked with you for a couple of years is $21 or $21.50. Someone who's been there for 5 years.
Management salaries.
$28 an hour.
Right.
So across the board, rising wages.
Taxes.
And all that stuff. And what you start to recognize, it isn't just that you want fewer people. If I'm going to hire somebody and they're going to cost me $22, $23, $25 an hour, I'm not going to hire a 16-year-old. 16-year-olds, as we all know, I was 16 once, you were 16 once. 16-year-olds are modestly brain damaged. That's part of the condition known as being a teenager. We outgrow it. That's one of the beautiful parts of growing up. You get out of that stage. But what it means for your employer is I don't want a 16-year-old here now. I don't know if they're going to show up for work. They're probably not going to be with me through 3 months. I'm going to go find an adult who's going to be with me for a while, who can work more hours per week, because if I'm going to pay that much money, I'm going to get somebody for who I think, whether it's real or just perceived, someone who is going to give me a more productivity, hence hopefully offsetting some of those higher costs that much more. So it isn't just that you hire fewer people, you hire more adults, fewer kids. And it's not just kids. We saw this in our earlier paper. It's disabled people. And by the way, when you think about kids, it's typically kids of color who see the hit more, right? So the people who are most at risk are the ones being hurt by this higher minimum wage. And
the intended beneficiaries of a minimum wage increase are the ones that are getting the short end of the stick.
Well, actually, yes and no, Jot. I'm going to be a little cautious on that. First of all, we have to acknowledge one thing, that the cost for these kids is not just the loss of a summer job. There's a bunch of literature out there that shows us not just that our results are actually right. There's been plenty of studies out there that show that kids take the hit. It's not just me. This is a well-worn path in the academic literature on this topic. Thus, it's not a surprise to see this happening among this particular population for sure. And it's not just now. It's not just the loss of a summer job. It's not just a few bucks. What the literature also tells us is that there are long-run consequences to this particular issue. Look, when you think about kids' long-run success, we see milestones, things that are important to these kids, things that predict they're going to do better in the future. For example, I've gone on and on that we should be focused on pre-K education. If you really want to help low-income families, help these families by getting these kids, these lower-income, poor families, into school as early as possible. If you get kids into a pre-K good education that improves their chances of getting through high school, and then in turn improves their chances of getting into college, which in turn improves their overall life success. Well, the same thing here. The data clearly shows that kids who have opportunities to work when they're 16 to 19 have a much better increase in overall life success. They do better. They're more likely to get into college. They're likely to get into the labor force. They're going to have career paths in front of them. In other words, you deny this kid a job now, and it hurts them for a long time. Now,
they're economically stunted for the rest of their lives.
Now, what's interesting about this is, there are those on the left who will tell us that the minimum wage is costless. But some of the data is pretty blunt. Like I told you, that they try to deny that the minimum wage has an employment effect, and they're able to do that because, well, at least up until the last few years, the minimum wage has been low enough to make that effect fairly subtle. In other words, within the noise, within the fog, if you will, they can create a narrative that says, oh, this is costless. But it's been harder with teenagers. This has been pretty well documented. And the story, actually, for a lot of these centers is, well, they're kids, it doesn't matter. It's way more important that 28 or 29-year-old who maybe has a kid, that they have a dignity of a big paycheck than it is for that kid to have a job. I mean, that's kind of the mentality. It's almost as if, well, the kids aren't important. Because you know what? When they're 24, we're going to make sure that they have a high enough wage regardless. I guess maybe that's their thought process, right? But they have acknowledged this problem, and they say it's not important. Well, I disagree. I think that what we are doing to kids in this state is horrendous. You cannot just wipe this off the map as if it's completely unimportant. This is an enormous issue. It's a very real issue. We're not solving the problem. We're not reducing income inequality. We're not making our world more fair. What we're doing is we're hurting kids, and we're making fast food more expensive for low-income families. That is what we're accomplishing here. So in a very real sense, have they improved social outcomes through this frenetic push for this particular policy and the many more that seem to be coming down the pike at us? No, they're not really moving the chairs. They're virtue signaling. They're making themselves feel like they're fighting the good fight and doing the good thing, and ultimately the consequences for the California economy are becoming clearer. It's becoming a more and more expensive state, and a state in which kids really don't have opportunities to succeed in this world. And this is not the state I want to be in.
This, when you were talking about, that study that you did that caught a lot of attention and sort of created sort of the drama that we were talking about at UC Riverside. This paper is likely to get some attention.
I hope it does.
And it's safe to say that there's a connection between the plummeting labor market fortunes of youth in California and the FAST Act.
Well, the FAST Act and the overall minimum wage. There's no doubt that the FAST Act has had a particular issue here because the FAST Act has caused the minimum wage in fast food restaurants, not all restaurants, fast food restaurants, to go up to $20 an hour. That is certainly part of the issue, as the case may be, but it's the overall $16 an hour minimum wage for the state that is also having part of the impact as well. So it's not just the FAST Act. I would argue it's the overall minimum wage. And to also be clear, it isn't, and I think this is something else that's important here. A lot of the folks who support these policies tend to live in high-cost coastal economies. They live in San Francisco. They live in Los Angeles, right? And you don't see this impact as much there as you do in other parts of the state. So, again, you can live in San Francisco, you live in San Mateo or Marin, and continue to exist in this little bubble of disbelief. But if you really want to see at the ground level, go out to Fresno. Go out to Bakersfield. These are much lower cost places. Housing is cheaper. Everything's cheaper. Core labor market equilibrium wages are lower because it's cheaper to live out there. Wages don't have to be as high. And yet we have the same minimum wages in these parts of the state as we do along these incredibly high-cost coastal areas. $20 an hour, a minimum wage for fast food restaurants, probably has had no impact at all in the city of San Francisco. My guess is many years ago in the city of San Francisco, those fast food restaurants had to pay more, over $20 an hour to get someone to work there because it's incredibly expensive in San Francisco. Right?
Yeah.
That's already built in. And it's okay. You can pass the cost on to the folks who are coming in the door every day because everybody's higher paid. So that's fine for San Francisco. That is not true for places like Fresno and Bakersfield. And that's one of the tragedies here. Again, the folks who support this stuff really don't even have occasion to see the impact they're having. They've probably even never been to Fresno.
This is probably an unfair question to ask you because we've seen the FAST Act impacts a narrow band of businesses in California. On the ballot this November is, people aren't really paying attention to it, which is frustrating, is there's an $18 an hour minimum wage measure that is going to be put before the voters this November. If that passes, give me your crystal ball. Do you see the same type of impacts cascading throughout, not just beyond fast food restaurants, but retail, and the impacts that you've sort of uncovered here with youth unemployment issues here in California as a result? Are we likely to see that exacerbated by an $18 wage?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, it's not just that. That $18 an hour minimum wage isn't getting a lot of attention. I think that even some of the people on the left don't want it because they have bigger goals. I heard chatter of wanting a $20 an hour minimum wage for everybody, right? And again, why are we doing this? We've kind of bit onto this bait that says that this is a costless policy. And as a result of that, those who support this kind of stuff feel that they're in a position to continue to just hit this and hit this and hit this ad nauseum. And understand, if you bring this up to people on the left, well, isn't enough enough? Isn't $16 enough? And they'll tell you, no, it's not. There's a whole core on the other side which has this idea of a living wage. You've heard about living wages, right? And I'm not even getting into the concept of the living wage, but let me give you one result of the living wage currently. I just looked this up the other day. According to the folks who create living wages, the living wage here in L.A., if you want a living wage, you have to be making $28 an hour. That's what they're saying. Now, your median full-time worker in Los Angeles County is making $27 an hour. So they're saying that the minimum wage should be higher in LA
than the median,
than what the median full-time worker is working right now. This is insanity, because every time you do that, prices go up, which turn around and make the overall living wage go higher. And what you see them doing is this: they want to push this till everybody makes the same wage, which is insanity. We've seen that fail in communist countries, right? Yeah, it's absolute chaos. But the real question is when does the narrative shift? They could do this now. They have a space of impunity, because to date, all the other chaos going on has kind of hidden this. But now, suddenly, it's starting to become crystal clear. You're seeing the impact among kids, and it's only going to get worse. You're seeing the impact in restaurants. It's only going to get worse. If they push it higher, it's going to get worse.
Okay, but how long can they get away with this? It's a costless policy narrative. I remember, a couple weeks back, you and I are eating a couple steaks with some really good onion rings, by the way. Those were so good. And we're talking about these narratives that are being pushed out of these labor centers in UCLA, UC Berkeley, that have continually put out the studies and papers and fomenting narratives that say it's costless. But the evidence is pretty clear. I mean, how can they deny, what we're seeing as a result of the FAST Act and what we're likely to see as a result of this minimum wage ballot measure?
They can continue to deny, because denying is their MO. I mean, that's what they've been doing all along. They've built a powerful narrative. They're riding that narrative. And they're going to continue to be able to ride that narrative until the narrative changes. And this is one of the reasons why we're doing this paper. This is one of the reasons why I'm having this conversation with you right now. People have to start being aware of what's going on in order for it to slow down and hopefully at some point in time being reversed. But I want to go the next step on you. You want to know when this is going to get really ugly? That's the next recession. Because right now you're finding the consequences within a full employment economy, which are going to be relatively muted because of the fact that overall labor demand is high. We know we have a full employment economy. There are labor shortages. At some level, businesses need to just suck it up and pay this to keep up with demand. But the next time we have a recession, and there is always another recession, well, then the consequences of this are going to become crystal clear. When you look at the United States versus Europe over business cycles, Europe, of course, has always had much higher minimum wages up until now than we have. Well, every time you have a higher minimum wage in a big recession in Europe, they have an enormous unemployment effect, and much less of what I would call, what we have in the United States. We have less employment effects, but we have more of a wage effect. That is to say, people's wages take a bit of a hit, but they keep their job. In Europe, they lose their job, because you can't lower the wages. You can't roll with the punches, so to speak. And so the labor market impact of a downturn will be much, much, much more severe in California because of what we're doing right now. Our state is going to be uniquely vulnerable to what happens in the next recession. And that is something when we're really going to wake up to the problems we're creating for ourselves.
Chris, one of my favorite things about being your friend is that I feel like I'm back in college in an economics class. I learn so much every time we have a conversation, and I appreciate the work you do. You're a truth teller. I'm assuming when this paper gets out there and people start talking about, well, they can't kick you out of the UC Riverside, though. There's no consequences.
Not yet.
So, not yet.
They already kicked me out of there. The question is what next? Well, listen, at some level, I founded Beacon almost 20 years ago on the basic idea that we don't sell answers. We don't start with the answer and then back into the analysis. We are a group that will be as true to the data as possible. And I mean that, by the way, for both sides of the fence. On this stuff, I certainly annoy the left. There's plenty of other conversations I can have that can annoy the right. What I try to do here is just be as honest with the data and reality as much as I can. By the way, I also should say one other thing on this particular front, maybe something I should have said earlier. When it comes to conversations like, say, the FAST Act, look, I'm not saying, for example, that these are morally wrong and these are terrible things to do. What I'm saying is that a democracy is a place where we have honest debates about policies. We recognize that policies have costs and benefits. And sometimes maybe the financial costs are greater than the financial benefits, but it might be the right thing to do. I'm okay with that. But we have to start out with the honest conversation. And that is what is tragically lacking nowadays. We're not willing to have that honest conversation. The extremes on both sides of the debate feel perfectly comfortable, perfectly at ease, that the moral imperative is greater than the value of being honest, that it's better to lie our way to the policies that we want. Well, I can go through the litany of cliches on that particular front. It's a slippery slope. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and on and on and on. What we need to do is take a step back and acknowledge true costs and true benefits, and then have the debate about moral imperatives. We need to step back from that particular line in the sand that we've crossed too many times. That's my basic plea. Now, will it be heard?
Well,
probably not, but I'll continue to say it anyway.
Well, we've come to the end of the hour. Dr. Thornberg, renowned economist, truth teller. Really appreciate your time here today, and we're looking forward to reading that white paper when it is released, and look forward to a conversation in the future.
Excellent, Jot. And as well, always a pleasure to work with you and your organization as we both go about trying to make California a better place to live and do business.
And now it's time to hear from CRA's legal partners, who are here to answer your Ask CRA questions. This is Ask CRA.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm back with a question and an answer from one of our valuable members. Here I have someone that operates a dinner house. This is sit-down dining. And they asked that if I have a server that shows up to work one day and business is slow on the floor so that I cut them, do I have to pay them for their whole workday? And the answer is very clear in California for the labor code. You have to go ahead and pay employees what's known as show-up pay. That show-up pay is a minimum of 2 hours of pay, up to 4 hours if that represents 1/2 of their total scheduled day. What this means is if you've scheduled an employee for 6 hours, you're going to be paying them a minimum of 3 hours if you send them home. If they're scheduled for 8 hours, you're going to be going ahead and paying them for the maximum 4-hour show-up pay under the labor code for that time that they showed up and you cut them from the floor because business was slow. I hope this goes ahead and helps the restaurant community, and I'll see you next time.
We hope you enjoyed Confidential Bulletin. Your membership helps us advocate statewide on your behalf. You can also access tools and education that can help you be a better and more profitable operator while connecting with more than 22,000 like-minded hospitality professionals just like you. If you are not a member, join us. Check us out at calrest.org. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or professional advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the management.